Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before answering. If someone had sat you down at 50 years old, someone who had walked through enough of life to know, and said, "Here are 5 things you need to understand about your relationship with your children," would your relationship look different today? For most of the people I've worked with over the past 40 years, the answer is yes. Not because they didn't love their children, they did, deeply. But because love, on its own, is not always enough to keep people close. And what they wish someone had told them, at 50 or 55, or even 60 thus, are things that most of us only learn in hindsight, after the phone calls become less frequent, after the holidays get quieter, after the distance has already grown. Today, I'm giving you those 5 things. Not as a lecture, not as a list of regrets, but as a set of truths you can take, hold in your hands, and actually pass on to the people you love most. Because here's what 40 years in this work has taught me: it is almost never too late to say the right thing. But it can become too late to say it in time. So let's begin. For many years, I've sat in rooms with families in some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Mothers and fathers who felt invisible to their adult children. Sons and daughters who loved their parents deeply, but couldn't explain why they kept a certain distance. Grandparents who had more to give, more wisdom, more time, more presence, but didn't know how to offer it in a way that would actually be received. What I've seen, across thousands of conversations, is a pattern. And the pattern is this: the pain in most parent-adult-child relationships doesn't come from a lack of love. It comes from a gap between what parents feel on the inside and what they've actually expressed out loud. Between the lessons they've learned and the words they've never said. Between the person they've become and the version of themselves their children are still responding to. In this video, I want to walk with you through 5 of the most important things I've seen parents wish they had understood and communicated earlier. Each one comes with something I'm calling a message forward. A few simple, honest sentences you could say to your adult child this week, not to fix everything, not to demand a reaction, just to close the gap, a little, between who you are and what they know about you. Let's take them one at a time. The first thing I wish more parents had understood at 50 is one of the most uncomfortable truths in family psychology. Your children do not owe you closeness. Now, before you react to that, I want to be very clear about what I mean. I'm not saying your children don't love you. I'm not saying the sacrifices you made don't matter. I'm not saying you don't deserve to be loved in return. What I am saying is this: closeness in adult relationships is not something that can be inherited or demanded. It can only be chosen, freely, willingly, and repeatedly. And when parents, even well-meaning, deeply loving parents, operate from a sense that their children owe them closeness, something quietly goes wrong. Because children feel it. They feel the unspoken ledger, the invisible accounting, the weight of all that has been given, hovering in the air whenever they visit, whenever they call, whenever they make a decision their parent doesn't approve of. And over time, even the most devoted adult child begins to associate time with their parent with a feeling of debt, of never quite measuring up, of spending time together not because it nourishes them, but because failing to do so would carry a cost. This is not what any parent intends, but it is what many parents inadvertently create. The shift I've seen make the most difference, in family after family, is what I call moving from expectation to invitation. Expectation says, "You should want to be close to me, after everything I've done." Invitation says, "I would love to be closer to you, not because you owe it to me, but because I genuinely want to know who you are now." That is a completely different energy, and adult children feel that difference too. The message I'd invite you to share: I've been thinking about something. I realize I've sometimes acted as if you owe me your time, your attention, your closeness, and I want you to know you don't. What I want, what I really want, is for you to want to be here. And if there's something that's made that hard, I would rather know it than pretend it isn't there. That is not weakness. That is the kind of courage that actually rebuilds relationships. Lesson 2. Your silence about your own struggles pushed them away. Here is something I've heard from adult children again and again in sessions where their parents weren't in the room. I never really knew what my parent was going through. They always seemed fine. I didn't know how to connect with them because they never let me in. And here is something I've heard from parents again and again in sessions where their children weren't in the room. I didn't want to burden them. They have their own lives, their own problems. Do you see the gap? Parents protecting their children from the truth of their inner life, believing that silence is kindness. And adult children, on the other side of that silence, experiencing it not as protection, but as distance. This is one of the most common and most painful disconnects I see in families. Most parents over 60 grew up in a generation that equated emotional restraint with strength. You didn't talk about your fear, you didn't share your grief, you handled it, quietly, privately, alone, and then you showed up for your family with a smile. And in many ways, that was an act of tremendous love. But here is what that generation of parents didn't know, what many of them still don't know, is that vulnerability is an invitation. When you share something real about yourself, a fear, a regret, a moment of confusion or sadness, you are not burdening the people who love you. You are opening a door. You are saying, I trust you enough to let you see me. And that trust is what creates closeness. Not shared silence, not performed strength. Real closeness is built in the moments when someone says, "This is hard for me," and the other person says, "I know. Tell me more." If your adult children have never had that kind of conversation with you, it's not because they don't want it. In many cases, it's because you never gave them the chance. The message I'd invite you to share: there are things I've been carrying for a long time that I've never talked to you about. Not because they weren't important, but because I was taught that keeping things to myself was the right thing to do. I'm starting to wonder if that kept us further apart than it needed to. I don't need you to fix anything. I just want you to know me a little better than you do. That is not a burden. That is a gift. Lesson 3. You confused giving advice with giving love. This one, I say with full compassion, because it is one of the most natural things a parent does, and one of the things that creates the most friction in adult relationships. When your child is struggling, your instinct is to help. And for most parents, helping means offering a solution, sharing your experience, pointing out what you see, telling them what you would do. That instinct comes from love, genuinely, completely from love. But here is what your adult child hears. They hear, "I don't trust you to figure this out on your own." They hear, "My way is better than your way." They hear, "Even now, at your age, you need my guidance." And so they stop sharing. Not all at once. Gradually. They stop mentioning the difficult things. They answer, "I'm fine," without detail. They keep the conversations light and surface level because every time they brought something real to you, they walked away feeling managed rather than understood. This is not a failure of love, it is a failure of translation. What you meant to say was, "I care about you deeply and I want things to go well for you." What they received was, "I am still the expert in your life." The hardest and most important shift I've seen parents make in midlife and beyond is learning what I call presence over prescription. Instead of responding to your child's struggle with a solution, you respond with a question. Instead of telling them what to do, you ask them what they need. Instead of offering your map of the territory, you sit with them in the uncertainty. It sounds simple. It is profoundly difficult to practice, especially when you can see the answer clearly. Especially when you love them so much it hurts to watch them struggle. But I promise you, the parent who learns to sit quietly with their adult child's pain, without rushing to fix it, becomes someone their child wants to come back to. Again and again. I've noticed that I tend to jump in with advice when you share something hard with me. I think I've been doing it because I love you and I hate seeing you struggle. But I'm realizing that what you might need, most of the time, isn't my advice. It's just me, just knowing I'm here, so I want to try something different. Tell me what's going on, and I'll just listen. Lesson 4. You were afraid of being forgotten, and it showed. Let me say something that many parents feel, but very few say out loud. There is a fear that lives in the background of many parent-adult-child relationships. It's the fear of becoming irrelevant, of being slowly edged to the margins of your children's lives, of one day realizing that they don't need you anymore, not really, and of watching the center of their world shift to their own families, their own routines, their own version of what matters. It is a quiet and very real grief. And for many parents, it doesn't stay quiet. It shows up as phone calls that come just a little too often, as comments, small, almost offhand, about how rarely you hear from them, as guilt offered up gently, wrapped in concern. I just worry about you. I just don't want to be a burden. I understand you're busy. It shows up as hovering or as emotional withdrawal that punishes distance with more distance. I'm not saying this to criticize. I'm saying it because I've watched it happen in family after family, and I've watched the effect it has on adult children. When a parent's fear of being forgotten becomes visible, adult children don't respond by coming closer. They pull back. Not because they don't love their parent, but because the emotional weight of a parent's need becomes something they don't know how to carry. It makes visits feel heavy. It makes phone calls feel obligatory. It transforms time with you into a task, something to manage, rather than something to look forward to. Here is one of the most consistent paradoxes I've seen in this work. The more tightly a parent holds on, the faster the people they love pull away. Not because the love isn't real, because the fear underneath the love has become the thing the other person is responding to. The antidote, and it is one of the hardest things I've ever asked parents to do, is to cultivate what I call secure presence. Secure presence means, I am here, I am glad to be in your life, and I am not dependent on how often you call me to know that I matter. It means building a life rich enough that your children feel welcomed into it, not required to sustain it. The message I'd invite you to share. I want to be honest with you about something. I think there have been times when my fear of losing your closeness made me act in ways that pushed you further away. The checking in too often. The comments that were really me saying, "Don't forget about me. I don't want our relationship to carry that weight. I want you to want to call, not feel like you have to, so I'm working on that. And I wanted you to know." That level of honesty is rare between parents and adult children. It is also, in my experience, one of the most powerful things a parent can offer. Lesson 5. Forgiveness wasn't for them. It was the door you needed to walk through. Every family carries history. Some of it is light, small misunderstandings, moments of impatience, words said in stress that neither party has fully let go of. Some of it is heavier. Choices made during difficult years, periods of absence, emotional or physical, things that were done or left undone that left marks. And somewhere in nearly every family I've worked with, there is something, sometimes named, often unnamed, that sits between a parent and their adult child like a low wall. Not high enough to be a barrier, just high enough to prevent full closeness. What I've seen parents carry more than almost anything else is this: old resentments about things their adult children did or said, sometimes years ago, that they have never fully let go of. And on the other side, adult children carrying their own weight, things they never fully understood, or forgave, or found the language to talk about. Both sides waiting for the other one to move first. Both sides telling themselves that forgiveness would feel like surrender. In 40 years of this work, I have come to believe something deeply. Forgiveness is not what you give to someone who has wronged you. It is not an act of generosity toward the person who hurt you. Forgiveness is the act of releasing yourself from the obligation to keep carrying the injury. It does not mean what happened was acceptable. It does not mean the other person deserves peace. It means, I refuse to let what was then determine what is possible now. And it is something you do for yourself, not for them. But here is the extraordinary thing about that act of release. When a parent does it, when they genuinely lay down an old grievance, not to gain leverage, not to earn gratitude, but simply because they have decided the future matters more than the accounting, something shifts. In them, first. And then, often, in the relationship. because adult children feel it when a parent stops keeping score. They feel the space that opens up, the sense that they are being met as who they are now, not held accountable for who they were then. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that creates the opening for them to do the same. There are things between us that I've held on to for a long time. I'm not sure you know what some of them are. I'm also aware that you might be holding on to things about me, things you've never said. I don't want us to spend whatever time we have left on opposite sides of old walls. I want to start fresh, not by pretending the past didn't happen, but by deciding that it doesn't have to be the story we keep telling. I'd like to have a real conversation if you're willing. About anything. About all of it. Because you matter to me more than being right does. That is one of the most courageous things a parent can say. And in my experience, when it is said from a genuine place, it rarely falls on deaf ears. We've covered 5 things today, and I want to summarize them simply, the way I'd summarize them for someone sitting across from me in my office. 1. Closeness between you and your adult children can only be invited, never demanded. 2. Letting your children see your struggles is not weakness. It is the beginning of real intimacy. 3. Listening without advising is one of the most powerful forms of love you will ever offer. 4. The more securely you hold your own sense of worth, the more freely your children will return to you. 5. Letting go of old grievances is not surrender. It is the decision that the future matters more than the record. In 40 years of sitting with families in some of their most painful and most beautiful moments, the one thing I never heard at the end of a life was this: I wish I had stayed further away. What I heard, over and over, was the other thing. I wish I had said it sooner. You cannot change what has already passed between you and your children, but you are here, right now, with some portion of the future still ahead. And the future is made entirely of conversations that haven't happened yet. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until it feels easier or less complicated. It will not feel easier. Worthwhile things rarely do. Take one of these 5 messages, just one, and say it out loud with your actual voice this week. Not in a text, not in an email. Face to face if you can. On a phone call if that's what's possible. Because some things deserve to be spoken. I'm grateful you spent this time with me today. If something here resonated, if one of these 5 things is the one you've been circling without quite finding the words, I'd encourage you to write it down, make it your own, let it be imperfect. Because imperfect and honest is always better than polished and withheld. Until next time, take good care of yourselves and of the people who matter to you.